Finishing the first draft of your novel is an incredible feat, but if your goal is to ultimately get that book published, then it is just the first step you need to take to get your manuscript ready for the world to see it. That goes for whether you are planning to query literary agents and pursue traditional publishing, or whether you are preparing to self-publish. That's because a lot of the work with your story actually comes through the revision process. And many books go through multiple drafts before any reader actually sees it and buys it. When I worked at Penguin Random House and a top-tier New York City literary agency, most of the novels that we ultimately helped to publish went through several rounds of developmental editing, which refines big picture elements like character arcs, plot development, and pacing, as well as rounds of copy editing and proofreading before they were published. While they are a necessary and crucial component of your book writing journey, tackling revisions can feel incredibly daunting, especially if you have hundreds of comments in a Word tracked changes document, for example, and or if you need to make major structural changes to your story. As a professional book editor myself and someone who is dishing out that type of feedback on stories day in and day out, today I want to give you 3 techniques for how to revise your novel based on feedback from critique partners, beta readers, or a professional editor. Ultimately, you should choose which of these 3 techniques, or even honestly a whole different technique or a combination of them, that works for you and your writing process. Writing is a creative act. Everyone has their own way of doing it, as we can see in the classic plotting versus pantsing debate. So it really is important for you to do whatever works within your style and approach. I hope this does give you a framework for how to think about revisions and how to apply these techniques to your own process. If you are new to my channel and you haven't subscribed already, I recommend doing so. Every week, I either post a video with tactical writing tips like this one, or I talk about the book publishing industry, especially from the side of traditional publishing, which is my professional background. I also want to direct you to a free resource available in the description below. It is called my free story self-assessment. And if you are in the process of getting ready to revise your manuscript, this resource is perfect for you because it is going to help you evaluate all the major elements of your story and identify which are weaker and which are stronger so that you can figure out what you need to focus on in your revisions. I know this can be really hard for you to see for yourself if you aren't getting external feedback on your book. So I do think it is really valuable for you to do this exercise on your own in tandem with getting that external feedback. Once you get that download, it's also going to sign you up for my exclusive newsletter with tips and insights you're not going to find anywhere on my channel, so don't miss out on that. So let's talk about the first technique for revising your novel, which is going from big to small edits. This approach is when you revise your story by starting with the bigger picture, major changes that you need to make first, and then going through the smaller, more detail-oriented edits, such as changing the wording of specific sentences or tweaking specific dialogue exchanges. So an example of what a big edit would be is if you need to reorder and restructure your scenes so that you alternate between 2 different character POVs at a consistent and regular cadence from the beginning to the end of your novel. So with this technique, you would first move all the scenes in your novel to be in the right place, including omitting and adding any scenes that you need to, before diving into the smaller scene level edits where you are changing things that are specifically going on in that moment within the content of the individual scene. So in my view, this is the most efficient way to revise. And it is the best way to guarantee a major improvement on your next draft. Because when you internalize that holistic, big picture feedback from the beginning of your revision, and you lead with it as you return to the pages, those changes are going to then feel much more naturally and organically integrated in the story. And then once you turn to the scene level notes, you're going to have all these global, bigger edits in mind, and the draft is going to encompass all of them. Now, the downside of going with this technique is that the biggest edits can often be the toughest to conceptualize and execute, especially if you need to do something like think through a character's arc or a plot twist. So this can lead to some delays in your revising process if you need to step back and take some time to think through how you actually want to enact that feedback that you've been given and how you want to tackle that major piece of feedback. Keep in mind that these big picture changes often impact more than one scene. So you'll likely have to revisit multiple points of the narrative that reference whatever it is that you're changing. So ultimately, this approach does require you to do a lot of heavy lifting up front. So in my view, it is a bit harder to maybe start and get going, but the good news is once you get those big picture major changes out of the way, the rest of the revisions should come quite easily because they're much smaller. My next revision technique is the opposite of editing from big to small, and it's editing from small to big. So taking this approach, first you would tackle all of the smaller edits, those edits that are really confined to one individual scene or a specific changing of phrase, maybe changing a detail of a character's appearance, or adding a setting description to an existing scene. Then, after all of those smaller, isolated notes have been addressed, you will turn to the bigger picture edits that ultimately require a bit more effort. The major pro of this approach is that checking off all of those smaller elements can feel so satisfying, and it's ultimately easier for you to dive right into those edits. If you have a Word document from a developmental editor and they have given you hundreds of inline comments, for instance, it can feel really satisfying to go in and resolve each of those smaller comments. You can quickly get the number down from hundreds of comments to a few dozen comments. Basically, this approach is the same concept as checking easier and more straightforward items off of your to-do list before going to those things that are going to take a bit more time and energy. You might want to run a quick errand or respond to a simple email before turning your brain to the more time-consuming task, which is also where the bulk of your work actually is going to take place. So if you're someone who gets really overwhelmed with long to-do lists and needs to clear up as much as possible before you can actually be productive, then this technique could work well for you. The downside of this approach is that sometimes the bigger picture edits will actually make the smaller edits that you have already addressed null and void, such as if you ultimately determine via the big picture edits that a scene is no longer serving the overarching story or necessary. Then the time you spent going through all the details of that scene is now ultimately wasted. Depending on how many of those smaller edits you need to make, you might also run the risk of getting burnt out and exhausted before you even begin the bigger picture structural changes you need to make, which again is more important than the smaller details. Because with this technique, what you are essentially doing is delaying the major work that you have to do. It might be helpful to think about it in a home renovation analogy. With this approach, you're basically painting all of the walls, which is great and definitely improves the home, aka the draft, but you still need to replace the roof, which is ultimately much more important to the foundation of the house/story and ultimately is going to require a lot more time, energy, and work. So you don't want to neglect that more important work you need to do. The final revision technique I want to go over today is what I'm calling the chronological approach. With this strategy, you will basically tackle all of the edits, including bigger edits and smaller edits, chronologically as they appear from the beginning to the end of your story. So you're essentially going to read through it and make those edits as you go. So for example, say that near the beginning of your manuscript, you have a scene where two characters are fighting, and you have both a big picture edit and a smaller edit you need to address with it. The bigger picture edit could be that you need to change the content of that fight. And therefore, anytime the fight is referenced throughout the rest of the story, say it's a major inciting event of the plot, you're gonna have to then change how the characters talk about it and all those future points as well. And then maybe the smaller edit is that you need to change the location where they fight. But that edit is only isolated to that individual scene and only requires a few sentences to be changed. So with this technique, you would go ahead and address that bigger picture edit, as well as all those points later in the manuscript where you need to adjust based on the change you make in this scene in question, and you're also going to make that smaller change at the same time. And then you're going to move on to the next scene and treat it the same. The benefit of this approach is that it helps you ensure continuity between scenes because you are going through the story sequentially. This helps you step into the reader's shoes and understand how they are going to encounter and experience the story. It also helps you identify any gaps or any errors that need to be corrected, which can pop up, especially when you're working on multiple iterations of your story. This technique can also feel a little bit more approachable than the big to small technique, because you are going back and forth with addressing bigger picture edits and smaller edits at the same time, so your brain can take a break from that more intensive work to do the smaller edits and go back and forth in that way. The major con of this approach is that it's easy to fall down rabbit holes and then get lost in the revisions. So for example, if you have that situation I referenced where you need to change a future scene to match the change that you just made earlier in the draft, then it can be tempting to start revising that scene and then going through it. And then that takes you to another place in the manuscript, you start revising that. So if you are going to take this approach, you need to be very disciplined and organized and make sure you know exactly where you are within the manuscript. Now remember that these are just frameworks at the end of the day, and they're just certain techniques and ways to think about your revision process. But you should ultimately tackle the revisions however makes sense to you and however they feel the most feasible to you. Just like there is no right way to write, there is no right way to revise. I hope this ultimately helped the revision phase of your drafting process feel more doable and achievable, and boosted your confidence and excitement going back into your manuscript. Let me know in the comments what phase of the drafting process you're at, whether you just finished your first draft, you're still working on it, or you're already on your 5th draft. And if you have a preferred revision strategy, definitely let me know. I'd love to hear what works for you. If you're looking for some more tips on editing your own work, check out my video where I go through some easy ways to self-edit your manuscript, some things to catch as you're going back through the draft. And as always, if you found this video helpful, please hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget that free story self-assessment waiting for you in the description below. Thanks so much for watching, and happy writing.